I will be leading As the Deer Pants. As the Deer. Number 71. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. I want you more than gold or silver, only you can satisfy. You alone are the real joy giver and the apple of my eye. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you.
Great job, boys. Appreciate it a lot. Awesome, awesome. All right, I need a few pastor outers. Who's it going to be? Yeah, there you go. One more. There you go. There you go, Doug. Thank y'all. Oh, Mr. Gene, I think you have more. Go give Bill some of yours. All right, here we go. Thank you. We're good. Here you go. Thank y'all. Appreciate it. Everybody will get one. So, all right. So let's dig back into the late comer. So from the beginning of the Bible, we see humans trying to put an emphasis and put a special place on people's birth orders. And it's so weird because in pretty much every example we see in the Bible, when people try to elevate someone to first, most important, whatever that is, it's like God is flipping that narrative. He's like, hey, I'm going to take the latecomer. That may be the second born. That may be the 11th born. That may be the downtrodden. It may be the second wife. Ooh, we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. But God is constantly saying, hey, I want this person to represent my firstborn. And that's our goal. We are trying to become God's firstborn. It doesn't matter our birth order. We know that doesn't matter. And how do we become God's firstborn? We do that by following the firstborn of all creation, which is Jesus Christ. Jesus is the firstborn of all creation, and he told us how to do that by telling us that for us to be first, for us to be God's first, for us to be God's firstborn, we have to become least, less. We have to put ourselves down here and become servant of all in order for God to lift us with his Son up here. And so this is a theme of the Bible. It's something that we see beginning in the garden with creation, just in humans. Humans were the latecomer. We were created last, but yet God made us rulers over things that he created before day 6. And so it's a theme because we see it, thank you guys, at the very beginning, and it runs its course all the way building up to Jesus. Today, we are going to look at some folks, beginning with Abraham, who basically at times tried to play the part of God. They were saying things, at least with their actions, like, God, I'm going to try to make these blessings come true in my life. Even though you've promised me that you are going to do it, I'm going to kind of try to play your part and going to do it for ourselves. We're going to see that in Abraham a little bit. We're going to see that in Jacob and Esau a lot of bit. And so let's get into what we're looking at today. So the main idea, we'll be building up to Jacob here in just a moment, and we see the same theme kind of throughout Abraham's life at times as well. But the irony of Jacob's life is he spends his entire life manipulating and swindling his way into the blessing God had already intended for him. He is going to bless Abraham. He is going to bless Isaac. He is going to bless Jacob. And they know this, but yet they continue to try to play the part of God at times and say, yeah, God, even though you're in control, I'm going to try to, put a human stamp on it. I'm going to try to speed up the process a little bit. Maybe you need a little help here, God, instead of just letting the story play out naturally. And so we'll get to that here in just a moment. But before we do, let's look at the bottom of your sheets on the left, and let's kind of quiz you guys on some of these people and things we're about to talk about. Who was Abram's wife? Sarah, or Sarai, before his name is later changed to Abraham. So you can put that on the first blank. Who gave birth to Abram's first son? Hagar. Hagar. So keep that in mind. Abraham's first son. Who was Abraham's oldest son? Ishmael. Ishmael. It wasn't Isaac. That's the next one. Which child was born to Abraham and Sarai? That would be Isaac. So we have Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, Isaac. How old was Abraham when Isaac was born? Anybody remember that one? 100, let's go. 100. Who was Abram's nephew? That's who we're going to get into first. Lot. Who were Isaac's sons? Jacob and Esau. So these are Abraham's grandsons, Jacob and Esau. Which son was born first of those two? That would be Esau. Okay, they were twins. Raise your hand if you're a twin. I knew we had a few twins in here, triplets. Raise your hand if you twin or triplets. I see some in the back. All right. So one came out before the other. Which son was born second? Jacob was born second. Which son received the primary blessing from Isaac? That'd be, yeah, so that would be Jacob. That'd be Jacob. So, all right, so that's going to get us to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 12. And let's see. There we go. All right, so Genesis chapter 12. We're just going to kind of summarize part of the story, and then we're going to have a discussion of kind of what's going on here a little bit. So your heading probably says the call of Abram. At this point in time, his name is Abram. Later, his name is going to be changed to Abraham. And God is, remember what he's looking for. He's looking for a snake crusher. Since the garden, there's been a prophecy that God made as soon as sin came into the world in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And it's a promise of Jesus coming in the future. And what these people don't realize is God is orchestrating a lineage of people, a lineage of kind of partial snake crushers that are leading up to the ultimate snake crusher of Jesus. Because remember that prophecy, it said that the snake, it's going to strike your heel, but somebody in the future is going to come and crush your head. And we know today that that's Jesus. These people didn't have this in mind. They didn't know that they were in this lineage of snake crushers that God continues to choose. And so when we look at these people that God continues to choose, they're not perfect people. They are not Jesus. But they are people who have at least a quality or two about them that jump off the page that are Jesus qualities, and qualities that God says, I want to use that. I want to use that quality to be a quality that I keep in my lineage, in my child's lineage, and I want to use that quality to help produce this future ultimate snake crusher. And so in chapter 12, here comes the next person in that lineage that God's choosing, and that is Abraham. And look at what he asked him to do. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So he's asking him to leave his father's household, and that's not an easy thing. He's asking him to leave what he knew. His dad was a patriarch. Usually the children stayed with the patriarch until their fathers died. And for them to leave and go out on their own, that was a big deal. So he's leaving his father, Terah, and he's going because he is obeying God. But he's not just leaving his father's house. He's leaving his father's gods. He's leaving his father's protection. Whatever it is, he's deciding to leave. And then you see in verse 2, God makes him a great blessing. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So the last part of that is the Jesus part, where, hey, you're not just going to be blessed. You're not just going to be blessed by people who bless you and all that. But it's not just your children. All nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Okay? He's not picturing Jesus in his mind, but that's who this is talking about. This is who this is leading up to. But look at what happens when he leaves. Verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. So here's Abraham. He's leaving his home country, and here's Lot. And who is Lot, again, in comparison to Abraham? His nephew, okay? So that means it is Abram's brother's child. So why does Lot not stay with his dad? Nahor. Any thoughts on that? Okay, so that's what we do know. Okay, his dad did pass away. So you can You can write that down. That's the first question on your sheet as a for sure. That is something that happened. Lot's dad passed away. Now, go ahead.
Probably also saw the divine favor that Abram had, and so he wanted to join him as well.
Ooh, that's good. So Eli says that maybe he saw the divine favor, because look at what happens right before this. Like, God's made promises to this man. His father is dead. If I follow him, maybe I'll receive a blessing too. Okay, so that's not explicitly said here, but I think that's a logical conclusion. You can write that down. Why else may he have left his home with Abram? Maybe he just needed a fresh start. And multiple times we see Abram later call Lot. It's a word that's closely associated with the word brother. Some of your versions may say close relative. Some of your versions may call him brother. But it's almost like Lot is in the place of Abram's brother since his brother died. So he kind of is a brother. Now let me ask you this. What does Abram not have at this point in time that he is soon going to obviously want? An heir. An heir. Okay? So why does he not have an heir at this point? What? Didn't have any children. Yeah. Who are they kind of putting the fault with? Sarai. Okay, they're putting the fault with her. Like she's the one. I don't know how they know. Like she's not able. I mean, I don't really want to get into all that, but she's not able. And God, what does He just promise Abram? He's going to be a great nation. What does he need to be a great nation? Kids, okay? So think about if this is you. What's already going through your head? You're thinking, all right, God, how are you going to do this? It does not appear that he is even considering Sarai as an option. Does anybody wonder if that may be why he took Lot with him? Because in these times, if you're not able to have children, you could have children through someone else, or you could have, your brothers could have children, and they in a way could be considered your child if you do not have a child. We don't know this for sure, but it continues to be implied because later he talks about this servant of his called Eleazar, and he's talking to God, and he says, God, you haven't given me a child yet, and if I die, this servant in my household, Eleazar, is going to inherit everything. We're going to get to that in just a moment too. So maybe he brought Lot because he didn't know how his lineage was going to continue. All right, so we've said maybe a few times. There are some clues that some of these could have some validity, but ultimately we're not sure why Lot left his home with Abram. So interesting enough, so going back to Noah, Noah had how many sons? Noah, how many? 3. Okay. Terah, who is Abraham's father, had how many sons? 3. With Noah, it was not the first one that continued to be in the lineage to get the ultimate blessing. It was Shem, who was not the oldest. That was Japheth was the oldest. And in the story of Abraham, Abraham, Haran, and Nahor, the Bible does not tell us explicitly who is the oldest. Now, Jewish teachers, some of them teach that Abraham was the oldest. Some of them teach that Abraham was the youngest. And even though Abraham's name comes first in the story, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's the oldest. Because remember, with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, it was listed with the oldest being last in those three. So we can't look at the names and say that he's the oldest. But what we can see here is we're really seeing the first story where we have brothers, siblings, who do not necessarily seem to have a rivalry at this point. And so maybe God's already seeing something in this man that he wants to have in his future snake crusher. All right, so let's go forward and let's look at chapter 13. This is where they've moved, Abram, Lot, all of their things that they have with them. And in chapter 13, we see that God blesses Abram, and exactly like Eli said, because Lot was with Abram, he is blessed as well. And they have so much stuff, so many animals, so many servants, that there's not enough room for them anymore. And so look what happens here. And I want you to notice, is there anything that compares to Cain and Abel? Is there anything that's different than the story of Cain and Abel? So let's look at verse 5. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot. So here's quarreling. So up to this point, it's been pretty peaceful as far as we can tell with Abram. But here comes this quarreling. Now, at this moment, this has the potential to follow the road of every story up to this point, and a lot of stories after this point, because here's basically his brother. I know it's his nephew, but it's his close relative, translated in a way like his brother. Here's his brother, and there's quarreling going on, and this can go completely haywire at this point. And we talked about with Cain and Abel. Their parents could not control this animal. This animal controlled them. And then here's Cain, and he's struggling with this inner animal, and God tells him, you got to get control of it, or it's going to overtake you, and you're going to do something you wish you hadn't done, and he can't do it. And here we have an opportunity where quarreling's going on, but what does Abram do in verse 8? Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. So, what does he do here? Say it again. He lets Lot decide. And that's a different attitude than we've seen so far in the Bible up to this point. Now, keep in mind, if Lot is there to one day help carry on the line of Abraham, he's just sent that line away. And it's right after the story where God blesses Abram again, and then in chapter 14, chapter 15, verse 2, but Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one whom will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus? You have given me no children. So this is right after he sent Lot off. And it's like, man, there goes my chance. And it's like, here's this servant that's going to inherit all of my stuff. How can all nations of the earth be blessed through my seed if I don't have a child? And once again, it doesn't even appear that the idea of Sarah having a child is even coming to his mind, at least not in the narrative at this point. All right, so, and I have this written down on your sheet, but the dynamic between Abram and Lot fits into the firstborn story with one key difference. Abraham lets Lot choose whatever land he wants settle on. Instead of being closed-fisted and greedy and attempting to dominate the land for their family, Abram is open-handed because of his trust in God. He chooses harmony. So let's go back up one question. How is he generous in the story? So Nancy already said he let Lot choose first. So write something along those lines if you've not done so. He let Lot choose first. And I just kind of put, he did something opposite of everybody before him. So he did the opposite of everyone before him. He was generous to Lot. And there's a lot of Eden comparisons when Lot's looking and he's seeing the same words as used in the garden. When Eve saw the fruits, he goes to this place, he goes to this sin city, even though it looks beautiful. But let's look at this next question. How does Abram's generosity compare or contrast to previous stories? Let's start by thinking about Cain specifically. Do you remember anything about generosity in the story of Cain? Who is a generous person in that story? You're thinking, oh, nobody's generous in that story. Okay, Abel, he brought his best to God, so he was generous to God in that way. Who was generous to Cain? Nobody? God was generous to Cain. He spared his life, right? He said anybody who kills Cain is going to be cursed like 70 times more. And he had a blessing, even though Cain was put away, like his parents were put out of the garden. He had to leave where he was. He had to leave the Eden blessing, so to speak. But God was generous to Cain in that story, even though Cain did not deserve it. Here we see Abram, in a sense, he's playing God here. He's being the generous party. He's learning from what happened with Cain and Abel. And he's saying, you know what? The story works out better if I, at least in this instance, act like God and have this character trait of God in my life. So this is an example of God's firstborn sharing. This is opposite of what we've seen up to this point. And in fact, there's a story right after this about him going to Egypt with Sarai, and it's him basically trying to manipulate a blessing out of the Egyptians. Here, he's the one that's being generous. He's the one that's creating a blessing for his brother/nephew. So once again, this had the opportunity to go completely haywire, but he knew, you know what? God is a generous God. and he's still going to have something for me, even if I let Lot choose first. Remember last week we talked about this parable. We called it the parable of the latecomer, where all these workers were given the same amount of money, even though some worked for a short time and some worked for a long time. And the last was paid first, and it ends by saying that the last will be first and the first will be last. And so he's trusting God's generosity here. Back in the story of Cain and Abel, God was displeased with Cain's sacrifice, but it didn't mean that God wasn't ready to bless him and be generous to him. He just let this inner animal take over the moment. He didn't understand that there's enough of God to go around. Just because he had more favor on Abel's sacrifice didn't mean that it was all over forever for Cain. He still had a choice. And so here, Abram is saying, you know what? I understand that lesson. I don't have to learn it the hard way. I'm going to let you choose first, Lot, because I know my God is a generous God. He's already made me a promise. And just because you go and take the best land doesn't mean there's not going to be something for me from God as well. And so he's a man who recognizes God's generosity in that sense. Any comments about that? All right. Let's look at chapter 16. You can turn on the back of your sheet. So we see this continue to play out. It doesn't appear Abram is wanting Sarai. Not that he's not wanting. He's not picturing her being part of this plan. And then in chapter 16, we see a new kind of twist in the story. There's this Egyptian slave that lives in their house named Hagar. And first off, isn't it interesting that she's Egyptian? We know that Abraham's become very rich with lots and lots of things and lots of servants. There's a story here in a chapter or two over where we see him go and defeat these kingdoms basically with just the people who lived in his household. But I think it's interesting here that they are going to abuse this Egyptian woman, and later the descendants of Abraham are going to be abused by Egyptians for hundreds of years. So isn't that ironic? Now, Sarah, Abram's wife, had bore him no children. So here comes this Egyptian slave named Hagar. Down at the bottom of verse 2, perhaps I can build a family through her. And so he sleeps with Hagar, and he does have a child. What's the name of this child? Ishmael. Down in verse 6, it says, Sarai mistreated Hagar. Down in verse 10, before we get there. So in this part of the story, let's look at our next question. When we think about Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Isaac, Ishmael, who are the latecomers in these stories by human eyes? Who are the latecomers? Who is the second wife? Hagar. So, right, Hagar. Who is the second son? Isaac. So the latecomers are going to be Hagar and Isaac, who are the second wife and second son. Now, we think, we know that Isaac is blessed, but what about Hagar? Well, there is a blessing for her too. Just like there was God helped Cain and gave him an opportunity. There's going to be a blessing for Hagar. Next question, who are the firstborns in the story? Who's his first wife? Sarah. Okay, so write that down. And then who's his first son? Ishmael. So what we see here is we see the latecomer wife have the firstborn son, but the blessing goes to the secondborn son from the first wife. Okay? So, what is God saying in this? And I've kind of paraphrased that to the right of those questions. Even within repeating themes and consistent ways God works in the world, we can't predict the exact method he will use. Here he chooses the first wife, secondborn son, the son that could have been born by no other means than sheer gift of miraculous work of Yahweh. The way God works will sometimes look confusing at first, but we must choose whether we trust his goodness of God's character. So they try to take matters into his own hands, and it kind of backfires, and God gives the latecomer wife the child before the first wife. So how do the characters in these stories become impatient with God's plan? What are they trying to do? They're trying to make God's promise happen. That's a good way to word it. Write that down. Hashtag Nancy Maddox. You're laughing like you know what a hashtag is. Yeah, and they're kind of playing the part of God. They're trying to bring the promise about itself. But think about it. I've always wondered, why didn't God just tell Abraham from the beginning, I'm going to do this through Sarah? He could have done that. But think about how we learn things in life. We learn things through experiences. And if he had just told him from the beginning how this was going to happen, he would have tried to find a way to mess up God's promise. If God told you what he has in store for you 30 or 40 years down the road, you're going to mess it up because you're going to try to go and take it right now. You're going to try to do it your way instead of letting God's way naturally play out. We would mess up God's story. And so we're in the middle of an experience, and the experiences that we have in our lives can lead us to something pretty great if we will let it. So where do we see God's generosity in chapter 16? Down at the bottom, there's a promise to Hagar in verse 10. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. So later, after Abraham and Sarah send Hagar off, God takes care of this woman. God takes care of this child and blesses them too, because God's a generous God. Now, they may not be the line that God uses for the snake crusher, but God still blesses them as he can bless anybody. All right, so finish this out. We'll kind of pick up next week and get into Joseph and Moses a little bit. But read through these passages with Jacob. We didn't quite have time to get to him today, but a very similar following that him and his brother Esau had in their life as Abraham.